Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another day, another foggy day on the top of Mount Olympus, where we attempt to peer down at the world below and pass Olympian judgments upon all their foolish doings. But, of course, it is foggy, so we struggle sometimes in that endeavour. My name's Mike Pierce, by the way. Why do I always forget to say that?
Well, as long as you remember your name, we're all right, I think.
No, I'm capable of these days.
Right. And my name is Coel Campo, and today is the fourth and final episode in our series, The Agony of the Catholic Church. And the title of today's episode we've called Lancing the Boil, Vatican II and After. And so, of course, our picture here is showing us the Second Vatican Council in session.
That's right. Yes, the Second Vatican Council took place from 1962 to 65, and the whole series, for those who have not been paying attention or have, had their brains wiped since the last episode, the whole series has been looking at this 170-year agony of the Catholic Church from 1789 and the outbreak of the French Revolution, and how it was just so difficult to adjust to the modern world, because the Catholic Church is an institution really designed for very different circumstances, ideally for the Middle Ages, and its consolation prize was, in the early modern period, divine right monarchy and absolutism, and of course the French Revolution was just blowing all of that away, and it was disintegrating very fast during the 19th century, and the papacy was huffing and puffing at the rise of all these modern movements. And as we saw in the previous episode, that led to some very, very unfortunate situations indeed in the first half of the 20th century, which simply had to be put right. And the Catholic Church had to find a way of coming to terms with the categories of modernity, whether it was nationalism or capitalism, socialism, democracy, religious toleration, and so on.
Right. So they've had the First Vatican Council, which was the first time that the church really had to address the effects of modernity.
Yeah, that was back in 1869 to 1870, and it had issued strident edicts against all of these modern phenomena. In fact, just a few years before, in 1864, Pope Pius IX had explicitly denounced the idea that the papacy should reconcile itself to, how did he put it, progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Those are not the words of his enemies. That's the words of the Pope. And so this was really tricky, and after the experience of the two world wars, something fundamental had to change. And the Pope who grasped that nettle is Pope John XXIII. So he's a new Pope in 1958 after the death of Pius XII, and he described his idea for calling another Vatican Council an inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Well, here we've got a picture of him. Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, Pope John XXIII from 1958.
So, what was Roncalli before he was elected pope?
Well, he had been a papal diplomat for some years, but he'd also been Archbishop of Venice. And then he's elected in 1958. It's worth looking at some stuff that he'd said in respect of the Jews and his actions in respect of them, because whilst anti-Semitism was a very widespread phenomenon just generally right across Europe and North America, and the Catholic Church was by no means free of it, he, more than most, was determined to distance the Catholic Church from that. So long before he became Pope, he had a history of benevolence and help towards the Jews. He intervened constantly in a number of countries to save Jews during World War II. There's a whole list of his various interventions in different places. And perhaps most important of these many interventions was the one in Bulgaria. And remember, Bulgaria is Orthodox, not Catholic in the first place. But he persuaded King Boris III to cancel his instruction to deport Greek Jews to occupied Greece, which of course would have meant delivering those Jews into the hands of the Nazis. So he persuaded the king to scratch that. And he says we are conscious today that many, many centuries of blindness have cloaked our eyes so that we can no longer see the beauty of thy chosen people, nor recognize in their faces the features of our privileged brethren. We realize that the mark of Cain stands upon our foreheads. Across the centuries, our brother Abel has lain in blood which we drew. Forgive us for the curse we falsely attached to their name as Jews. Forgive us for crucifying thee a second time in their flesh, for we know not what we did.
Yeah, this is really impressive because it's a very conscious break with the earlier rhetoric about the Jews.
Yes, it was a widespread belief, perhaps particularly in the Catholic Church, but amongst others as well, that the Jews were somehow under a sort of collective curse. And the verse so often applied is Matthew 27:25. You remember when Pilate doesn't want to execute Jesus and offers to the crowd to release him, or you can have Barabbas. And they said, "Oh, give us Barabbas." And Pilate washes his hands ritually or ceremonially, as it were. And we've got that phrase that we still use, I wash my hands of this. That it goes back to Pontius Pilate. And the mob cry out, his blood be upon us and our children. And that had been understood as a sort of collective curse upon the Jews down the generations, as if they were guilty of the death of Christ. I mean, like we're not all guilty of the death of Christ when one thinks what that was for. So, yes.
Yeah, and that's more of the sort of thing that was reflected in that really horrible newspaper article by the Catholic priest that was in Dalmatia that we looked at last week.
Yeah, that was written during World War II under the Ustasha regime in Croatia, which was essentially Nazi. So John the 23rd is taking all of that and standing on its head and saying the flat opposite. Now, he calls the Second Vatican Council in 1962. So we've got a picture of him here giving his opening address. It's quite long, and so we're just giving the most important features of what he says. It's kind of, it's in the middle of the speech, right? Most of it would have been unsurprising, maybe even a little boring. And as with so many political speeches, you need to listen for the thing that's just kind of sneaked in. And in a way, that's the whole point of the speech. So here is that crucial passage. In the everyday exercise of our pastoral ministry, greatly to our sorrow, we sometimes have to listen to those who, although consumed with zeal, do not have very much judgment or balance. To them, the modern world is nothing but betrayal and ruination.
Yeah, but surely it wasn't just some Catholic leaders who thought this. This had been the standard line of the church as a whole.
Yes, that's exactly it. And that's why this passage is so important. He's put it in his own, you hear this kind of thing sometimes. My gosh, you hear this kind of thing all the time because that has been the standard line right through the 19th century, right through the first half of the 20th century. There had been a little wobble there under Leo XIII at the end of the 19th, but although even he really had taken this line. So he's throwing it out as though it's just some things that some people say sometimes. But this is the nub of the problem, and that's why this passage is so important. They claim that this age is far worse than previous ages, and they go on as though they'd learned nothing from history, and yet history is the great teacher of life. Yay, John the 23rd. Of course, history is a great teacher of life. I also have to smile at the first half of that sentence because, of course, preachers of all denominations and stripes are very good at claiming that the age they live in is worse than all previous ages. And then when we look back at some of the previous ages, you realise, well, maybe the present isn't so bad after all in some ways.
Right.
Okay, they behave as though the first 5 centuries saw a complete vindication of the Christian idea and the Christian cause, and as though religious liberty was never put in jeopardy in the past. We feel bound to disagree with these prophets of misfortune who are forever forecasting calamity as though the end of the world is imminent. Our task is not merely to hoard this precious treasure of doctrine as though obsessed with the past, but to give ourselves eagerly and without fear to the task that this present age demands of us. And in doing so, we will be faithful to what the Church has done in the past 20 centuries. I'm not sure that really doesn't fly in the face of some of the things that the Church has done in the past 20 centuries. But the whole process that's being laid out by this council is what was called aggiornamento. Giorno, Italian for day, so it's kind of hard to translate. That's why it's always the Italian word is always used, I guess. Let us say, and this is not a great translation, bringing things up to date or attuning oneself to the time that the Church is living in. That's really, I guess, the point here.
Right. So he's saying we need to modernize. And
yes, essentially that's it. Okay, well, the Second Vatican Council produced an awful lot of very long documents, which it would be tedious to try and work our way through. So what I've done here is, because all of these podcasts are in some ways creating a kind of cartoon image, although one that is as true to the reality as we can possibly make it. So I've reduced this here to a simple list of bullet points. So purists will, as ever, be striking their brows in disgust. But too bad. This is summarising essentially what the council was about. Its principal reorientations. So the hostility to modernity qua modernity is dropped. Even communism is at least to be engaged with.
And this is because so many Catholics are now, at this point, living under communist rule.
Yes, they are. The number of Catholics living in what had been the Soviet Union between the wars was fairly small. But given the result of World War II, there's the whole population of Lithuania is now within the Soviet Union itself. And the western parts of Ukraine, which had been Poland, are now within the Soviet Union. But the newly redrawn borders of Poland, almost all of the people living within that country still are Catholic. The population of Czechoslovakia, most of them, at least nominally, the Czech half is pretty secular, but Slovakia much more devout. About 60 to 65% of the population of Hungary, and within communist Yugoslavia, well, the populations of Slovenia and Croatia and a chunk of people in Bosnia as well. All of these are now under communist rule. So the council determines that other Christians it starts referring to them as separated brethren rather than as schismatics or heretics, which had been the traditional line. And the church is to engage, at least, with the ecumenical movement, which had been getting going, say, from about 1910 onwards. Anti-Semitism is completely condemned. And I should say that this is part of a general phenomenon. I know I've tried to stress this before, that anti-Semitism was absolutely an ordinary phenomenon until the 1960s. You know, our instinct is to suppose that anti-Semitism was killed off along with 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and that thereafter, you know, everybody recoiled in horror from this opinion. Not so. Right? It's the 1960s that sees a real turning point. Of course, there's still anti-Semitism, but it's since the 1960s that it's been a socially unacceptable opinion. Let's put it that way. Religious toleration is now endorsed, not condemned. The Mass may be celebrated in vernacular languages, not just in Latin. And the laity are to be considered crucial agents in the life of the church. The second to last point there concerning Latin, the knowledge of Latin had really sunk in modern times. I strongly suspect that most illiterate medieval peasants understood a fair amount of Latin. But even though literacy had shot upwards in modern times, the widespread knowledge of Latin had been shrinking and shrinking. And so moving away from Latin is another way of including the laity more fully in the life of the congregation and in the churches, that it's not just something that's said over their heads, so to speak.
Yeah, and a lot of these are things that the Catholic Church probably felt like made the church, and so this has got to be a pretty big swing for them.
Oh, yes, we shouldn't underestimate the amount of resistance that there was to all of these changes, as we shall see in a moment. Yes, for many, this was extremely hard to accept. Yeah, it seemed to them to be undermining so much that the church had been and had represented. Yes. Now, sadly, John the 23rd died during the second year of the council in 1963, and he's replaced by this man with the extremely long name, Giovanni Battista Enrico Antonio Maria Montini, who had been Archbishop of Milan. And he now becomes Pope Paul VI. And I have to say, I'm dating myself a little here, that this is the first Pope of whom I have anything like clear memory. Well, I mean, or any memory, actually, seeing him on TV screens. He came across to me when I was a child as being very nice and very unexciting. Right? He wasn't as charismatic, as it were, as his predecessor, but very well-meaning and a
Right.
little earnest.
Yeah, he's going to carry on a lot of the work of the Pope before him, right?
Right, yeah, he was fully in tune with his predecessor. Well, we've got a description here from a book written not too long after the council. This is a largely commentary or description of what went on in Vatican II concerning the debate on religious toleration. The traditional teaching of the Roman Catholic Church is, briefly, that there's no such thing as an inherent right to religious liberty. In countries, therefore, where the Catholic Church is dominant, there is, or should be, no religious liberty. Though where it is not dominant, for example in the United States, it will claim liberty for its own opinions. There can, in fact, be liberty only for the truth as defined by the Church.
So the Catholic Church hadn't taken on the 18th century idea of human rights yet.
Right. Now, this is hard for modern Westerners to accept now, but the idea doesn't predate the 18th century Enlightenment, so called, whose ideologies the Catholic Church continued to resist. But that was now changing. So if people are not familiar with this idea that human rights doesn't really have an existence before the 18th century, we would refer you to the series of podcasts that we did on my book Why the Rest Hates the West, and we had a whole episode there on the issue of human rights, I think. So please do go and take a look at that, and that will explain, how this came into existence and what its implications are, and so on. Now, the Protestant reformers in the 16th century had taken the same pre-modern view when confronted by radicals. I'm thinking in particular, because it's something that came up in my doctoral researches, of a debate by letter between that extremely unpleasant man, John Knox, the Scottish reformer, and an Anabaptist who took exactly the same line as the Catholic Church did. Though, of course, he would not have been very comfortable to have that pointed out to him, that there's liberty only for the truth, and that the Anabaptist has no claim for the truth. He can't plead the cause of conscience because his conscience is not in alignment with the truth, as understood by John Knox and the Reformed. That was the line that was taken. And many non-Westernized Muslims would still take that kind of view. And the explanation in all three cases is the same, that they are not affected by the 18th century Enlightenment's ideas on human rights. Okay, so the position was summarized during the debate by the Spanish Cardinal Arriba y Castro. Now remember that Spanish Cardinal in the early 1960s is living under the Francoist regime, this very hardline right-wing dictatorship in Spain, which will endure to the mid-1970s. Only the Catholic Church has the duty and the right to preach the gospel, and therefore proselytism by non-Catholics among Catholics is illicit and must be obstructed not only by the Church, but by civil authority itself. And on this doctrine, many Vatican political parties have in the past been based. The opposite point of view was put forcibly at the council by the English Cardinal Heenan. We must be clear on this. It's completely absurd to say that error has no rights and that only truth has them. Rights are rooted in persons, not in things.
So Heenan is actually taking the human rights outlook for granted.
Right, and that's why he uses a strong word like absurd, because if you are a Brit, never mind with your Protestant, Catholic, atheist, Jewish, anything you like, in the 1960s, human rights are a taken for granted idea, right? They've saturated right the way through society. Whereas if, like Arriba y Castro in Spain, they are a novel idea, they don't make an awful lot of sense. Right? They might do in Spain now, but they don't in 1963. Right? Yes, that's exactly what's going on. Okay, this statement may seem obvious to a Protestant coming from a liberal democratic background, but for many of the conservatives from Catholic countries, it was heresy and folly which would spell the ruin of the Catholic Church. Indeed, Cardinal Arriba y Castro prophesied precisely this, the ruin of Catholicism. Nevertheless, the liberal position carried the day. The change of outlook was based, as Cardinal Heenan emphasized, on a recognition of the basic rights of the human being. So the Enlightenment ideology from the 18th century. Now, why did the liberal position carry the day? Given that the liberals came from, well, in Catholic terms, countries like Belgium maybe, but mostly from Catholics living in majority Protestant countries like the Netherlands, like Britain, like the United States, like Canada, and so on. Surely their opinions would have been outweighed by the majority coming from Latin America, the Iberian Peninsula, and so on. Well, no, because they were augmented at the council by bishops from communist countries who took the view, how can we plead with communist governments for toleration for ourselves in countries like, say, Poland, when we won't grant the same freedoms in countries where Catholics are the overwhelming majority? So that alliance, people with very different experiences of life, if you're like Cardinal Heenan or an American bishop or something like that, your experience can be very different. Just some poor soul in Warsaw or Prague, right? But nevertheless, they came together on this. And so that did, in fact, carry the day.
Right. So religious toleration had become so widespread and accepted at this point that the Catholic Church really just couldn't ignore it anymore.
Well, yes, it's certainly widespread in the Western liberal democracies that I mentioned there. But in communist countries where there was no toleration for anything except state atheism, how are you going to hold your line and say, no, we should have toleration unless we're prepared to grant it? And so it's part of the liberalizing wave. Now, we're just going to mention very briefly here two very important Catholic theologians who became prominent from the time of the council. Before this, they'd been rather marginal because the Catholic Church as a whole had been so conservative. We need to mention the German Jesuit Karl Rahner, SJ stands for Society of Jesus, he's a Jesuit, and Hans Kuhn, and so they emerge, as it were, from the shadows during the council, and for several decades afterwards, they are amongst the most important of Catholic theologians, although Hans Kuhn tended to go too far for future popes and found himself sanctioned in a number of ways. We can't pursue his career now, but nevertheless remained extremely influential. Now, we said a few moments ago that the Catholic Church from this time onwards starts to at least engage somewhat in ecumenism and also in dialogues with other faiths. And I've picked up here on a rather tiresome passage from a theological liberal who's expatiating on this point. Now it was written, I would say, in the 1980s. I should have checked exactly when, but around then, a chap called Donald Nicol. And some of the terminology he uses would not be used by many people now because discussions have moved on. But the kind of rhetoric he employs carried me right back decades to when this was a standard way of late modern liberalism and the way that it would talk. So, what are the implications of Vatican II's declaration on other religions? The very inner logic of the Council's various statements has gradually crystallized the fundamental issue which now faces Catholic theologians concerning what is called the uniqueness of Christ.
So, is he saying that Christ is unique or he's not?
He sounds like he's ambivalent on it, doesn't he?
Yes.
It's a kind of a hedging form of expression there. If he was emphatically for it, he would say, which now faces Catholic theologians concerning the uniqueness of Christ. But it's that what is called there. It sounds like he's humouring children.
Right.
He privately doesn't believe it, but hey, if you believe it, fine. Right. That issue can be stated quite simply. Since the Church now acknowledges seeds of the word in other religions and grants that adherents of these other religions may come to salvation by way of their religions, does it not follow that there's now no need for evangelization? I don't think the Council went quite this far. Does this not also deny any exclusivist interpretation of the gospel sentence, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except by me? Or of the text in Acts, there's no other name under heaven granted to men by which we may receive salvation.
Okay, so he's talking about an exclusivist interpretation, but what would a non-exclusivist interpretation of those verses be?
Well, I've heard liberals expatiate on these, and they tend to take this kind of line that people are saved through Christ. It's just that loads of them don't know they are. So I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. So everyone does come to the Father, and they do come through Christ, but most of them aren't aware of the facts. And then you take a similar kind of gloss on there's no other name under heaven granted to men by which we may receive salvation. So it's through Christ, but the others just don't know the fact.
Okay.
Right. In facing this issue, the Catholic Church has exhibited a fund of the wisdom that is secreted within it. He sounds like he's humouring us again, doesn't he? Anyway, above all, the Church's spokesmen have refused to be rushed into novel formulations which would not do justice to all the factors. Any attempt at the moment to produce a cut and dried formula regarding the uniqueness of Christ would therefore abort interfaith experience and close off the widening horizons.
So he's saying they're refusing to be rushed, but the church has had 2,000 years to think about this.
Yes, it has. Donald Nicol, the author here, is clearly prioritising interfaith experience and widening horizons over cut and dried formulae, by which latter he means clear doctrine. Right. So this is exactly the kind of infuriating woolly speak that people doing the kind of work that I do had to deal with a generation or so ago. The problems have changed now, but that's what it was like then. So you've got the flavour of it.
Yes, we feel your pain.
Yes, yes. I'm feeling the sarcasm there, but all right. So this then basically is the council. It's getting to grips with a whole load of its problems. It's lancing the boil that has been festering since the French Revolution. But a small minority of conservatives were more than merely unhappy with the outcome. They actively rebelled against it. And it would be useful to consider them, even though they were a relatively small movement. So, French traditionalists, a number of them, oppose the outcome of Vatican II. And we've got a commentary here about two of the most important figures in that movement. Firstly, Abbé Georges de Nantes. Okay, concentration on the ritual aspects of the church's life is a common feature of conservative movements. Alarm at innovations, such as the reception of communion while standing rather than kneeling. That was something else that Vatican II introduced. Again, making the laity feel more involved, minimizing the difference between priests and laity, but also, of course, downplaying a little the very, very strong emphasis on transubstantiation. It's still talk, it's still doctrine, but if you really believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation, then maybe all kinds of ritualized things like kneeling might seem appropriate, and they're no longer doing that, seems to be downplaying it. And giving people communion in the hand rather than simply asking them to open their mouths and popping in the wafer. The use of lay people to distribute the sacred species, right? So that the priest will bless it and say prayers over it, at which point transubstantiation is supposed to happen, but then give it to lay people to give to others. Again, for many conservatives, this was too much. The Abbé Georges de Nantes dates his disillusionment with the council to John XXIII's opening speech on the 11th of October 1962.
So he understood very clearly what the Pope was saying in that opening speech, and he rejected it.
Right, from the very beginning. And then his opposition deepens as we go on. His conviction that the Pope had fallen into heresy, however, he attributes to the Ordo Missae, the Order of the Mass, promulgated on 3rd April 1969. So, 4 years after the council itself has closed. And more particularly to a conversation he had 3 months later with the Dominican Gérard de Laurier, who, he reported, told me that Paul VI was no longer Pope. For a time, de Nantes was a leading proponent of those who believe that, with the Pope having fallen into schism, there is now no pontiff, the sede vacante theory, the empty chair or empty throne.
So he's essentially saying he's more Catholic than the Pope.
Yeah, that's exactly the ironic position of some of these ultras, yes. So he says, I reject the new religion. I refuse aggiornamento as an inspiration of the devil. And I nevertheless remain a full member and son of the church. The tyranny of the reformers has met a setback, he wrote in his monthly newsletter, La Contre-Réforme Catholique, for July 1970. One council document continues to crop up in his newsletter, that on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. Freedom of conscience and of religion is an error, he wrote shortly before the declaration was approved, insulting to God and pernicious for all human society.
And this is a bit ironic because he's French. There's been rigid secularism in his country since at least 1905, and he doesn't believe in religious toleration.
Yes, it is very ironic because Catholics, as much as anybody else, in France depend on the existence of religious toleration in order to be able to exist. But he wants to undo the laïcité, the secularism of the French state, and go back to a situation in which the Catholic Church is in charge and there is no religious toleration for anybody else. Yeah, really bizarre. And in a way, it's why they can't possibly win. Okay, well, it is a view that he shares with second major character in this movement, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. For both of them, the council reversed a century and a half of opposition to the French Revolution by endorsing liberté, for example, in the Declaration on Religious Freedom, égalité, for example, the doctrine of collegiality enshrined in Lumen Gentium, and fraternité, ecumenism.
So it's the late 20th century, and they're still resisting the French Revolution of 1789.
Yes, you can accuse them of a lot, but you can't accuse them of not taking the long view. and within their unfortunate frame of reference, you could even say they were right.
Well, wait, so are you on their side?
Well, I don't accept their frame of reference. Theirs is that of a church that should be running society and providing the rationale for its governance.
Oh, okay. So we're back to first base, right? You're an Anabaptist who insists that Christianity is no such thing.
Yep. So, but all I'm saying is that within their frame of reference, they do have an important point. The trouble is that their frame of reference is completely wrong. Yes. I'm so annoying, I know. And I do. I do enjoy it, and I bank on the fact that you do as well. Okay. So, for both de Nantes and Lefebvre, the rejection of the new Mass is central. And of course, because the new Mass, because of the way that it's celebrated, it's given to people standing up, they take the elements in their hands, it's distributed by lay people, and it's in vernacular languages. Thus, Catholic, the voice of Catholic orthodoxy, Lefebvre's monthly, published in Australia, listed as 26th among the 62 reasons why, in conscience, we cannot attend the new Mass. Because the new Mass was made in accordance with the Protestant definition of the Mass. I think we know what he means. Protestants don't actually believe in the Mass as Mass, do they? Okay, the Protestant definition of communion. And you could say that there's something in that. As I said a few minutes ago, it entails at least an implicit downplaying of the doctrine of transubstantiation. Yeah. Lefebvre's conviction that the Church has sided with the principles of 1789 is quite explicit. The Council consummated marriage with the Revolution, he said at Lille in August 1976. This union shows itself by the dialogue on equal terms between truth and falsity. It is not possible to dialogue with Protestants. We love them, and that is why we want to convert them. It's not possible to dialogue with Freemasons or communists, for one cannot dialogue with the devil.
So they can't dialogue with Protestants, but they want to convert them? How does that work out?
Megaphones would be my guess. I mean, there's no helping some people, is there?
Right, this sounds like a political debate on Facebook.
Yes, exactly like one of those, I think. Yes. Okay, well, to finish off this aspect of the topic, so both de Nantes and Lefebvre have displayed strongly conservative political tendencies. The Abbé de Nantes was born in Toulon in 1924 to parents who were royalist members of the Action Française, and people who saw the previous episode will remember that Action Française was something that was kind of fascist before there's fascism. It was remarkable in being hyper-nationalistic, but opposed to the principles of the French Revolution and wanting royalism and compulsory Catholicism. And de Nantes was himself, as a teenager, associated with the Vichy state of Marshal Pétain during World War II. For his right-wing sympathies, he was banished from the Diocese of Paris, into which he had been ordained in 1948, and then worked for publications associated with Action Française for 3 years. His opposition to the French withdrawal from Algeria led to, briefly at least, to his imprisonment.
Algeria?
Very, very briefly. Algeria had been not so much part of the French Empire as part of the French state. I suppose you could make an analogy with the way that the whole island of Ireland had been not part of the British Empire, but part of Britain itself until the division in 1922. It had been conquered by the French in 1830, and there had been violence for most of the time since. And from the mid 1950s, there was an appalling war of independence in Algeria with massacres on both sides, and it initiated trauma in France, from which France continues to feel the effects even today. But eventually, of course, there was no choice, just as with the British in Ireland, where the death toll was way, way, way lower. But nevertheless, the analogous situation there was no choice but for France to withdraw from Algeria. But he opposed that, of course. Lefebvre, 20 years older than Dunant, had closer personal experience of the Action Française and was a student at the French College in Rome at a time when the college was strongly influenced by the anti-Greece movement of Marat. Marat was the leader of Action Française. Since then, he's been a strong supporter of military regimes in Latin America, as one might expect, and has appeared in the company of far-right politicians both in France and Spain. Okay, well, those movements have not had a big future. They were never enormous at any point, but they are one kind of response to Vatican II. But now it's time perhaps to turn our attention to something far, far more hopeful that comes out of this, and that is the emergence of the Catholic Charismatic movement and the rapprochement with evangelicalism.
Now, charismatic here means the spread of Pentecostal type experiences like spirit baptism, speaking in tongues, healings to other denominations, and in this case, the Catholics.
Yeah, that's what it is. So this emerges almost immediately after the council. Remember, the Second Vatican Council is from 1962 to 65, and the Catholic Charismatic movement takes off in the United States in 1966 to 67. But it had friends in high places from an early point. So it's worth mentioning this man, not an American, he's a Belgian, actually, Cardinal Leo Joseph Sunon, who had been Archbishop of Mechelen, Brussels. He was a chief enabler of Vatican II, who's like a kind of fixer behind the scenes, setting the agenda, guiding some of its most important pronouncements. And after the council, he fostered the rise of the Catholic Charismatic movement, which did a lot to build bridges with evangelicals, particularly in the United States. Now, for many people, especially younger people watching this, it might be hard to remember now, especially in the United States, that evangelicals and Catholics had not been friends at all. American Catholicism may have been more politically liberal than it was elsewhere because of the circumstances in which it had to live, similarly in Britain. But that didn't make them friends with evangelicals. But in the United States in particular, what happens from the 1960s onwards and even intensifies in the 70s and 80s is a growing, friendship, you could say. I mean, in many parts of the United States today, evangelicals and charismatic or otherwise conservative Catholics have been living in one another's pockets for quite a while now, and that's a great thing. And it's Vatican II on the one hand and the rise of the charismatic movement amongst evangelicals on the other that makes this possible. And the Catholic charismatic movement kind of builds that bridge. So it begins in the US in 1966 and it spreads quickly around the world. It's quite important in Croatia, by the way, but I suppose America has always been the most important place for its growth. It's worth mentioning this man as one of its more important leaders, Francis MacNutt.
You gotta love that name.
Yeah, you have really. He was a Dominican, prominent leader of the Catholic Charismatic movement in the US. His 1974 book, Healing, was a bestseller. And in 1980, he left the priesthood to get married. Now, these leaders were, in a sense, pushing on an open door. We mentioned Cardinal Sinon a moment or two ago. He actually fixed things so that they were able to hold a conference in Rome. Well, one in 1973 and another one in 1975, and Pope Paul VI came and blessed them. So quite explicit that he's on their side. So it was a huge boost for them. So you've got people like MacNutt and a couple of other people we should mention here, Kevin and Dorothy Ranahan, the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. They're still alive. They're theological scholars. In 1969, having already become part of this movement, they established the Catholic-led but ecumenical. 90% of the people involved are Catholics, but it is ecumenical. People of Praise community in South Bend, Indiana.
Now, the People of Praise community came up in the news again in 2020 when Amy Coney Barrett was proposed for appointment to the US Supreme Court, and her membership there was used against her as if it was some sort of a disqualifier.
Oh, yes, because separation of church and state. You can't have religious believers holding any senior public office. Yes, it was indeed. But actually, she was born and brought up in that community. It wasn't something that she'd joined as an adult. So that was her whole background. That was where she was from. Okay, so we've looked in general at how the Catholic Church finally implements what I guess we can call aggiornamento and engaging with the modern world. But we want to finish with a debate that, whilst it reaches back to World War II, has actually played itself out in much more recent times. And the fact that this debate can happen underscores just how crucial it was for the Catholic Church to make the changes that it did in the early 1960s. And that means that we have to look at the debate over the role of Pope Pius XII during World War II. Now, some people are aware that there has been a furious debate about his career during that period. Was he simply engaged in quiet diplomacy to bring about an end to the war and to ameliorate conditions? Or was he actually complicit in genocide? Well, here is the Pope in question, Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, and the poor guy became Pope right on the eve of World War II. And you can see he dies in 1958, so he's the one who is succeeded by Pope John XXIII, who brings in the Second Vatican Council. Now, in the years immediately after the war, he was generally praised for his role during the war and also in trying to rescue the Jews of the city of Rome. But he first becomes really controversial 5 years after his death, when a West German playwright, Rolf Hochhuth, produces a play called The Deputy, which basically accuses Pius of being complicit in, I was going to say, in the Holocaust. The term Holocaust is not actually coined or used until the 1970s, but at least in the mass murder of Jews during the war. And there was a bit of a debate about it at the time, and the whole debate was kicked back into life to big effect in 1999 with John Cornwell's biography, Hitler's Pope. That's an incendiary title, without a question mark after it. Right? He's making a claim. must admit, I hate titles like the subtitle that he's got here, The Secret History of Pius XII, which I'm highly allergic to books with titles like What They Don't Want You to Know About, or, why the history books never told you, all this kind of stuff. It's an absurd way of talking.
Makes for great marketing, though.
Oh, gosh, yes, to brain-dead people who think that the world is one set of vast conspiracies. Yes. Well, Cornwall was a respectable enough writer, but I found myself already turning against him just in the early pages of his book, because, and I'm not quoting him exactly, and I don't have a copy of the book with me, but effectively what he says is, I had heard these accusations against Pius XII, and I set out to write a book defending him against these calumnies. But as I dug into the evidence, I was absolutely shocked to find that Pius was guilty as hell. So he's basically saying, it's the evidence that's driven me to this, not my predilections. But as you read on, he is ferociously inimical to all conservative forms of religion of any kind. He's totally buying into a very secular outlook on the world, politics, social life, belief generally, that I'm afraid I really, really struggle to believe that initial disclaimer. But it kick-started an orgy of publications that carried on for at least the next 10 or 12 years. Let's consider what could be said and has been said in defence of Pius XII's wartime quiet diplomacy. This is what the papacy would say on behalf of itself: that the Holy See could not condemn Nazi atrocities without also condemning those of the Soviets. I don't think that's a very powerful point, but okay. The Vatican would have to investigate the charges first. True, during war, this is almost impossible. And if anybody doubts that, we are not going to know how many people have been killed on both sides in the Ukraine war until the dust has settled several years after the events. Right? We didn't even know how many people have been killed in 9/11 for a couple of years after it happened. So imagine a whole war, right? The difficulties of assembling violations would be enormous. The danger of making errors in the heat of war is great. And for anybody who doubts that, just think about the lying and distortions that went on about the massacre of Polish officers in Katyn in early 1940. Right? The Pope had already condemned major offences against morality in wartime. True, but that's extremely general and vague. But the papacy specialises in general and vague, right? That's part of its diplomacy. When members of the church hierarchy spoke on such subjects, they did so on behalf of the Pope. Well, if they could speak on behalf of the Pope, why couldn't the Pope speak on his own behalf? And does the same thing hold good for that awful little oik Archbishop Šarić, or the fellow, what's his name, Kralik, whose horrible writings we looked at last week? Condemnation of specific Nazi atrocities would only worsen the precarious position of Catholics in affected areas. That's almost certainly true.
Yeah, so it's sounding like the best defense of the papacy is that it was feeble rather than malign.
Yes, I think that's about right. It was benign, and as is generally known, it did a lot to save, for example, the Jews of the city of Rome. Its interventions elsewhere were, let us say, suboptimal. Nevertheless, one Jewish historian, Marus, writing in 1987, points to caution as the Vatican keynote. He's kind of hitting a middle line here. He says it's true that Pacelli feared the triumph of Bolshevism in Europe. And of course, World War II did produce the triumph of Bolshevism in Europe. As I used to like to say when goading students in Houghton College, who won World War II? Communism won World War II. Look at a map at the end of the war. right? And people feared that. This is why so many people, leaving aside the whole Catholic issue, why so many people, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, were prepared to even fight for, or at least put up with, the Nazis. But Vatican documents do not indicate a guarded pro-Nazism or a supreme priority of opposition to the Soviet Union. Indeed, they indicate in many ways that Nazism was the greater immediate threat to and persecutor of the Church. Nor do they reveal a particular indifference to the fate of the Jews, let alone hostility to them. Rather, they suggest a resolute commitment to its traditional policy of reserve and conciliation. And again, I refer listeners back to the points we made about the papacy's role in World War I, where it ended up being condemned by both sides because the papacy wasn't coming down on their side. The goal was to limit the global conflict and, above all, to protect the influence and standing of the Church as an independent voice. So it's not great, but it's kind of understandable in a way. Now, I'd want to finish off here by quoting a really good assessment from Pollard, whose book we recommended to you in the last episode, The Popes in an Age of Totalitarianism. So please do go back and have a look at that. And what Pollard says seems to me to be hitting the nail very clearly on the head. With the publication and staging of Rolf Hochhuth's play The Deputy in 1963, Pius XII's wartime actions became, because they hadn't been before, the centre of major public controversy. In 1999, the argument was reignited by the publication of John Cornwell's Hitler's Pope, which has provoked a stream of polemical works, sometimes sickeningly hagiographical, going to ridiculous extremes to defend Pius, generally from very conservative Catholics, sometimes hysterically hostile. And I would say, having looked at a whole load of those works over the years, that's exactly right. Such is the nature of the dispute over Pius XII's response to the Holocaust that one seriously doubts whether it is genuine historiographical controversy.
Yeah, and that last part there, it sounds like he's saying this debate isn't really about history at all.
No, that's quite right. It's not. It is about now. Now, it should be said that an awful lot of expositions of history are actually in support of somebody's usually political, sometimes religious, occasionally even philosophical beliefs in the present, right? And of course, it's part of the self-appointed mission of this podcast series to be in Mount Olympus and to look down and say, blow that. Let's take a look at what actually happened, and regardless of the consequences for anybody's particular belief system, even though you and I are hardly without beliefs of our own.
Right.
Okay, so Pollard continues. There's by now a consensus among most historians of the papacy about what the Pope did or did not know about the Holocaust, when he knew, what he did and did not say, and what he did and did not do. What he's saying is that the actual facts are no longer really in dispute. Right? It's the assessment of them. The discussion of John Cornwell's views on American chat shows and the literally thousands of, in many cases, tendentious and sensationalist and often inaccurate newspaper articles in the early 2000s suggest that this is a highly political dispute between Jews and Catholics in the USA and between liberal and more conservative Catholics, those favourable or hostile to Pope John Paul II. Remember, John Paul II was pretty conservative, and latterly Pope Benedict XVI, who was exactly the same. I mean, they were like blood brothers, those two. John Cornwell has made it clear that his book has a political purpose to prevent the canonization of Pius XII. It also serves as a protest against the, quote, reactionary policies of the Polish Pope, John Paul II. Okay, well, so my own take on this is that on balance, Pius is not completely innocent, but he's not guilty as charged. He could have done better, but he was human, all too human, as most of us apparently are. But I tend to come down not on the hagiographical side by any means, but nevertheless on balance in favour of the defence, mostly because, as we see particularly clearly with Cornwell, the motives of his accusers stink to high heaven. But this whole unseemly spat simply illustrates clearly just how important Vatican II was, just how crucial it was for the Catholic Church to put its house in order for the modern world. You know, if it hadn't done that, and this kind of debate had blown up, which it would have done, just think of how that would have played out in a very different world and a very different Catholic Church. Right? Vatican II was absolutely crucial in creating the body that we know today.
And all of this going on after the poor guy died.
Right, yeah.
Nobody was brave enough to accuse him to his face, I suppose.
Well, no, they weren't actually. If anything, he got plaudits, including from Jewish leaders in the city of Rome and elsewhere. He was generally not exactly ecstatically well regarded, but fairly well regarded for his record during the war. Yeah, the whole thing became a huge issue after his death. That's right. Now, I'm really excited about where we go next week, because we're going to be starting a new series, which is going to be doing for evangelicalism what this series has done for the Catholic Church. And we're going to be looking at the whole topic of fundamentalism. And loads of this material is already prepared. And all I can tell you is, in my humble opinion, it's absolutely fizzing. So I'm hoping that people are going to really enjoy this. So we'll be subjecting it to the same treatment. And of course, both these series come off the back of what we were looking at a month or so ago, which was the issue of secularization and the secularizing of modern societies. And so this series has been looking at how the Catholic Church had huge difficulties in responding to that. We're now going to subject evangelicalism to the same kind of treatment, even if the issues look in many ways very different.
Yeah, and there's nothing like throwing around the word fundamentalism and getting people's blood to really boil.
That's right. Well, one of our first tasks in the first episode next week is going to be defining our terms. And I'm going to risk making myself even more unpopular by being quite rigid about what we mean.
Well, thanks everybody for sticking with us for another episode, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye-bye and see you soon.
Bye, everyone.